hidden in plain sight.
You're here for Hidden in Plain Sight, the series that explores the life and work of famed Elizabethan playwright Christopher Marlowe. I'm Julian Ng, your host for this series, and with me as usual are our resident scholars, Dr. Peter Hodges and Miss Carol Paxton. Welcome back, guys.
Hello.
Hello.
Today's episode is very special because we're welcoming a new addition to our conversation. Dr. Rachel Wifall, PhD, Professor of English at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, New Jersey, specializing in English Renaissance drama. Welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Julian. Hi, Peter and Carol.
Hello.
Hi.
Rachel, I understand that you're also a creative writer of poetry and fiction, and you've published academic articles on the staging of Shakespearean drama and the intersecting cultural legacies of Shakespeare and Jane Austen, as well as theatre and book reviews and journalistic articles on pedagogy and issues in Jesuit higher education. That is quite a resume.
I'm a bit eclectic, I think you could say. And I also have done research and presented some papers on Marlowe, and hence why I'm here. And I've been a fan of the podcast.
I'm delighted to hear that, and we're so happy to have you. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your teaching background and where your interest in Christopher Marlowe began?
Well, actually, this past summer, I attended the conference of the Marlowe Society of America, which was held in the Deptford neighborhood of London, in East London. And I was the first morning of the conference, there was a walking tour of this neighborhood. And Deptford is the neighborhood in which Christopher Marlowe was allegedly murdered. And so I'm on this walking tour of the area, and I hear some man talking to someone else. And I said, wait a minute, that's the guy from the podcast. I know that voice. And then met Peter, and we became friendly with some other scholars there too. We chummed around during the conference. We had a great time. And so now I'm here on the show, which is a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me.
But Rachel, you specialize in Shakespeare. So are you a Stratfordian by any chance?
Well, I am definitely going to be a devil's advocate. I am interested in the authorship controversy, although it's not something that I've invested a lot into before. And as I said, I really do have a genuine interest in the works of Marlowe, and especially I've done a lot of research into his astrological references in Tamburlaine, which I find very intriguing. But I'm just I'm coming along this ride and getting my own ideas more firmly cemented. I mean, we don't want to be closed-minded. We don't need to cement anything, right? There's so little that we actually have to go on that we have to keep an open mind always.
Absolutely.
Sorry, can I interrupt? Can I ask, you recognize Peter's voice, but why did you listen to the podcast in the first place?
Well, I'm part of a listserv called Shakespeare, and it's for people discussing all things Shakespeare. And there was an advertisement about the podcast, and I said, well, that sounds very interesting. I've always found the story and the intrigue surrounding Marlowe's life to be quite intriguing. And I said, let me listen to that. I'm often driving on a long commute between my family home in Long Island and where I also live and work in Jersey City, and it can be a drive with quite a lot of traffic. And so I really love listening to interesting things. And so I got hooked listening to the podcast on my ways back and forth. That's where I found out about it, though, with that organization.
Marvelous. Well, let's bring you up to speed then with the current season, Rachel, if I may.
Yes.
So briefly, in our first 4 episodes, we've been asking the question, could Christopher Marlowe have written the first 17 sonnets in the collection known today as Shakespeare Sonnets? Well, so far, Peter has presented us with his hypotheses that in 1590, it was the Lord Burleigh who commissioned the sonnets as a gift of encouragement for the 17-year-old Earl of Southampton, i.e., the richest man in England, to marry his granddaughter, Elizabeth the Vere. Carroll has presented background on sonnets in particular and why they were popular in England at the time. And together we have investigated the various poets who might have been capable of writing what are known today as the Procreation Sonnets, because they argue in favor of marriage. And as to the question of who might have written them in 1590, Carroll gave us some examples of sonnets written by the Earl of Oxford, who was Elizabeth de Vere's father, and another sonnet written by Christopher Marlowe. And we also examined sonnets written by others. Our consensus was that Marlowe's sonnet was clearly superior, and that if one wanted to commission a batch of 17 sonnets, well, Marlowe would be the ideal candidate for the task. Now, it is my understanding from Peter that you have a slightly different point of view on this question that you would like to share with us.
It's so interesting that Peter approached me with this subject exactly at the time that I was working with a class specifically on the sonnets. And when I told my students that I'd be taking part in this podcast, they were very excited. So, well, I will just offer this idea to begin with, that the decade of the 1590s was the peak of the sonnet vogue in England. And by 1609, when Shakespeare's collection of sonnets was published, or this collection was published, the form was a bit dated. So this collection of sonnets does invert and even mock many of the standard sonnet conventions, which would perhaps indicate that they were composed at a time when the genre was falling out of style. However, 11 years earlier in 1598, Francis Mears alluded to Shakespeare's sugared sonnets among his private friends, etc., in his work Pallidus Tamia. And 2 of the sonnets, numbers 138 and 144, appeared in a 1599 anthology called The Passionate Pilgrim. I'm not sure if you spoke about this yet. And also there was an entry by an Eliezer Edgar for certain other sonnets by W.S. into the Stationer's Register on January 3rd, 1600. Although no addition seems to have resulted from the entry, suggesting it may have been a staying entry intended to prevent other stationers from publishing an edition of them. So we have some sonnet activity there, 1598, 1599, and 1600, pointing toward Shakespeare. But it's therefore widely believed that the sonnets were composed over a span of time and brought together into a collection late in the author's life, as his dramatic works were, of course, collected and published by friends of his in the first folio some years after his death. So the sonnets within the collection are organized into a seeming narrative, which begins with these 17 sonnets in question. But, were they all written together is very debatable. So these 17 sonnets addressed by an older male to a younger male, that is the assumption, exhorting him to reproduce his beauty and commendable qualities to a biological heir. Then, of course, we have a span of poems which many have thought express the love and longing and inadequacies felt by a male poet who is in love with said younger man, and ending in a series describing the poet's sexual obsession with the, scare quotes, dark lady, the loose woman who seduces the young man of the earlier sonnets. So this has been the narrative, right? But the Procreation Sonnet was part of a popular genre of the time, which echoed themes and metaphors from a famous letter written in Latin by the humanist educator Desiderius Erasmus, and which circulated in English translation in Thomas Wilson's Art of Rhetoric as an epistle to persuade a young gentleman to marriage. These poems employ metaphors which are present throughout the sonnet collection, though, not just in these 17, regarding the human aging process, its relation to the natural seasons of birth, growth, decline, decay, and death. And I think most notably, only about a fifth of the sonnets actually specify the sex of the beloved. So there's this narrative of, okay, the first 17 are to a young man, then the other positive love sonnets are also about this young man, and then the more critical, darker sonnets are definitely about a woman. But as I say, only about a fifth of the entire collection really specify the gender of the beloved in question. So, it is possible that some of these exhortations to procreate or these expressions of love outside, outside of the regrets regarding the dark lady could have been addressed to a female. So in many of these poems, the author may have been posturing, creating imagined scenarios in order to engage with and also upend traditional sonnet conventions. So I would argue that the sonnets under consideration were probably not written altogether as a concerted effort toward one end. But of course, we're here to debate that.
We are. They're very much a group. They all hammer on the same theme time after time after time. And then we hit 18 and suddenly it's like flipping the album over in old style vinyl. It changes completely. There's a massive switcheroo. And not only are they all banging on the same theme, you're beautiful, you're wonderful, you must get married, etc. There's all the rose imagery, which I know Peter's not so keen on this, but I definitely think that points, not definitively, but it is certainly very much a point in favour of them being addressed to Henry Roseley, however he pronounced it. And the other thing that I always feel about the first 17, compared with pretty well all of the others, but not all of them, is that the first 17 are very conventional. They're somewhat impersonal. And then again, you hit 18 and suddenly it isn't. It really isn't this conventional, Peter, I think, said Hallmark cards at one stage in an earlier episode. It isn't like that somehow. There's a break point. It changes, which to my mind is very, very striking. But obviously that's my view. And it's also, I think, worth mentioning that certainly there are 3 Shakespeare plays, Love's Labour's Lost, Henry V, Romeo and Juliet, which are all fairly early and all contain embedded sonnets. And most fascinatingly, the famous line from 94, Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds, is actually directly in Edward III, which is a play that certainly dates from the early 90s, maybe even the late 80s. Some people have thought it an Armada play, and has a very strong association with Marlowe because Robert Greene quotes from it. And when he quotes from it, he says, if the cobbler hath taught thee to say. If Greene had said, if the glover had taught thee to say, we'd never have heard the last of it. And I find that quite interesting that we have this resonance, this quote. And which way does the quote go? I think it's from the play to the sonnet, but
well, let me jump in. Let me back up just a little bit, Rachel. Let me just, because you threw so much at us, and it's quite a spanner in the mix, if you will. And of course, it is more traditional way of looking at the sonnets, or let's say the way that has sort of been shaped, I think, now around the sonnets in the 20th century as the consensus has sort of crested on the idea that they could be biographical, since they don't seem to attach very biographically to the author that's on the title page. So with that, then I think scholars have stepped back from them and said, these are not biographical except in the odd instance, but perhaps we don't know what the structure is and so forth. And so I think what you're doing when you're making reference to the whole book is bringing a different context to this than we initially start with. Here at Hidden in Plain Sight, we're taking them as they were printed and making no other assumption about it other than what do they tell us. So if we start with the 17, we start with the 17 as that's what they are. They're 1 through 17. They have a commonality. We'll take them at that place until we can discover a reason, either within them or outside in the contextual world of the period of time, that indicates that they would not be a group. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're telling us that they could have been written to as many as 17 different people. Would that be, probably 17 is too many, but you're suggesting that the form of them is not particularly original, and that they could be something that were written as a series of addresses to different people on a similar theme. Fair enough?
Yeah, all of them kind of partaking of a trend. And obviously, there are definitely sonnets that seem to belong together, right? That there is something of a narrative when we have the kind of love triangle happening, it would seem, right? These are certainly very connected poems for sure, but they're connected thematically. So, were the various sonnets that were written over time and circulated mostly in manuscript form, were they then ordered, just put in order, like, oh, these have this in common? And actually, when you go to the midsection, let's say, of the sonnets, there are certain themes, of course, and certain emotions and attitudes that will come up again and again. But again, some of the sonnets are quite different, right? They also, as I said, don't necessarily specify a gender in most of them. When people always say that, oh, his sonnets to the young man, I really don't think that the middle sonnets or whatnot are connected in that way. That they don't seem to be. But yes, certainly when you're at the beginning of the sonnets and at the end of them, right, you feel more of a narrative pull, perhaps.
Well, let me explore that just a little bit. Let me just interject, because what we're grappling with, I think, right now is a question of context and of framing of what we appear to have in our hands, which is 154 poems. And so what we have defined at this moment is two different ways of looking at them. The way that we have been looking at them prior to this, and mostly by default and mostly by that's how I see them, and better or worse, that's how I see them, is that they're there they are. There's no reason to disassemble them at all. They are published in the order in which they were written. That's my first piece of contextual evidence, is that there they are. Now you're reversing that, if you will, and saying the context was provided by not the author, or if the author, after the fact. And that therefore we cannot seek within them a narrative.
I'm not saying you cannot. I'm just saying that it's possible. It's certainly, possible. But certainly the author is very consciously also playing with convention and things like that. So was there really a quote unquote dark seductive woman, or is this somebody that he has kind of created in his mind's eye to upend conventional sonnet, praise of women's fair beauty? And I think that a good case could be made for that as well, that, well, I'm going to counter all of this tired sonneteering and shake things up a bit, and therefore I'm going to create a persona that's everything one would not be looking for in your Lauras or the perfect women of the sonnets. Yes.
Yeah, and of
Yeah.
course, the name has suddenly gone out of my head, but the French troubadour poem that Keats based La Belle Dame sans Merci on was known at the time, and that whole idea of the wicked dark lady is very much a trope. I mean, it still is now, isn't it? Yes.
Yes.
I'm now playing Santana, well, it's actually Peter Green's Black Magic Woman in my head, because it's a trope that has gone back probably to classical times and is still really strong now. So I'd in fact be far more open to seeing those sonnets as maybe more divorced from the poet's life. However, the ones that I feel resonate incredibly strongly with a real person's real experience are what in Marlowe circles we tend to call the sonnets of exile, which is probably about 25 to the 50s, which very much speak of disgrace, banishment, journeys, loss, etc., etc. And conventionally those are in the fair youth bit, but they're not. They are, I think, a very strong group, and those, I think, resonate incredibly personally. You even get to the ones where, I mean, if my friend wrote me that, I'd be worried that they were contemplating ending it all, because they are that dark, they are that distressed, they're full of hurt, and I don't think that's a pose. I think those are real. But
oh no, I'm not saying that every sonnet's a pose.
That's me.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. There's certainly there is a a different tone goes throughout. But certain preoccupations that the Procreation Sonnets have, the seasons of age and the carpe diem, the carry on, you're not going to be young and beautiful for long, so let's perpetuate your beauty. Those preoccupations can be seen in other sonnets as well.
Yeah. Oh, well, they're ancient. In the Ovid that Marlowe translated, perhaps when he was a student, what I've noted down here, Book 1, Elegy 8. Brass shines with use, good garments would be worn, houses not dwelt in are with filth forlorn, beauty not exercised with age is spent. It's a really ancient idea.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I was talking about this collection in particular, but
yeah,
yes.
Yeah. But the point I think I'm making is that the ideas in the first 17 are very unoriginal, I suppose, in many ways. Yeah.
One thing I want to try to isolate on is this notion of context. As I'm listening to both of you right now, I'm seeing that it's very tempting to stray into the forest of all of the sonnets and to try to find relationships between them that somewhat muddy the message, if you will, because there are human themes throughout, and you will always be able to find a resonance from, say, sonnet number 20 with sonnet number 131, and or sonnet 21 and 131, I think it is, the golden hair and all of that. But you want to be careful about that, because it leads to a kind of cloud, and it doesn't lead to a definite space, a definite point. And my point here is that we're trying to focus on, arbitrarily, if you want to say so, the first 17 as a block. and what they can tell us and what we can learn from the time period when these would have been most effective in being presented. If, for instance, if you're going to say to me, they could have been written at different times, fair enough. 5 or 6 of them might have been written as a block, 2 more as another block, 3 more as another block, and given to different people. Okay, let's take that on its face, because you've also told me that the enthusiasm for sonnets declined. And so when they were most likely to have been received as a novelty of striking originality would have been early in the period that we're talking about, when sonneteering was all the rage. So 1590, 91, 89, somewhere in there. Tom Watson had just introduced it. We have the example of Astrophel and Stella, which hadn't been published but was being handed around. And later on, then, people aren't writing so many sonnets. And I would submit that not a lot of them were very good at it anyway. And I think that might have had something to do with the decline in interest. And so that if somebody in 1595, as a for instance, when sonneteering was in its initial decline, had written 3 or 4 of them to a young lady or a young man and proposing that they get married, and delivered those to them, they would be much less impressive than they would have been 5 years before. And subsequent to that, further attempts to do the same thing would be less useful, more like a Hallmark Christmas card than something that really, really made you stand up and notice. So what do you say about that, for instance, just as a thought? Now, I want to stick with those 17 and how you've described them. I don't want to go reaching into, all the thicket of the Dark Lady and the rival poet and, because those are very good things to explore, but I want to focus.
Well, these certainly have big thing in common, is that they all exhort the younger person to procreate. So they have that in common. They have that focus. And so, yes, it's entirely possible that they were created in batches in order to be an appeal. I have heard some of your argument about why you think that it was necessarily Marlowe who wrote them, but it is thought that Marlowe probably did collaborate with Shakespeare, especially on some of the early history plays and things like that. And I'm not closed off against that, but I want to get a stronger case as to why necessarily Marlowe also.
I mean, we have made the case for Southampton in our previous episodes, and we have made the case for Burleigh and Marlowe working for Burleigh and Elizabeth de Vere, and all of that being a package of real events that were really happening in 1590 when he was 17, and we have 17 sonnets that would have addressed Burleigh's issue very neatly, and we have an author who is quite capable of writing those sonnets who happened to work for Burleigh. And that is a contextual argument that can be made for these things that identifies real people that were really interested in doing something at the moment when this would have paid off the best. Right before rock and roll gave it up to hip hop, you do the rock and roll album to end all rock and roll albums. It's sort of like that. And you've got the Beatles all in one guy, and he delivers. And
we really should credit the Stones, not the Beatles. They're from the right part of England.
So that's a context. And to take the disassembly of the 17 sonnets, it does beg the question of what context can we provide other than to sort of muddy the waters. Now, if you want to attack the context that we're giving, I'd be interested in that. If you have a separate context that says, these were the first five, these are the next five, these two went to this person, or even just a profile of what that person would have been. Because I'll say this too, when you look at the 17 sonnets as a group and you read them in order, they're very self-referential. They're not just taken as a format that's repeated. They actually go, that one that I just mentioned, that when I was just talking about that, I meant this. And so he talks to himself as an author as he goes through it. He even brings up the point, hey, I'm the author. At a certain point, he kind of mentions himself, like, I'm doing this for you. And there's a continuity in built into the 17 that I think if you were going to try to take it apart and say, well, there are other themes that are reflected throughout the rest of the sonnets, I don't think I just don't think it leads you anywhere. It may be true, but it kind of just confuses me.
And then we have to say Narcissus, don't we? Because in a way,
oh, well,
Narcissus, which
yes,
the context of which is well established, in effect turns the conceit of the sonnets. You're so beautiful, you're so handsome, you're so wonderful, you should reproduce yourself, you should have a son. Narcissus is saying, you're appallingly vain. And in a way, you're vain, you're selfish, you're self-regarding. And in a way, it's almost the antithesis, the anti-17 sonnets, isn't it? It turns the carrot of the first 17 sonnets into a stick.
Well, I mean, in a context, it sort of reads like an angry retort to, an appeal having been made to a 17-year-old to marry, and he turns you down, and the retort is, well, then why don't you just stare at your own self in a pool,
And come to a horrible end.
And die or turn into a flower.
Turn into a flower, yeah. You know this anyway, that there's an intense relationship between Venus and Adonis and those 17 Procreation Sonnets, that they very much mirror each other, and that one can also say the same thing about Hero and Leander, that the themes that are found in Hero and Leander, which are so omnipresent in Venus and Adonis, are necessarily also reflected in the 17 sonnets. But that is actually for an episode that, well, we'll just have to pick up in our next episode, won't we? Rachel, will you come back?
if you want me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I don't think we've been fair to you at all.
No, I think it's most unfair making it sort of two and a half, sorry, Julian, against one. It's really quite mean, because Julian is a very good impartial chair, but
well, I hope also I wasn't banging on too long in that one, and that it came out okay.
Oh, it did, yeah. No, an argument that can't stand up to challenge is quite worthless.
Oh, and I don't mind that. I just felt like I was talking so much at one point that it was too long.
We've had 2.5 series to
and it's actually lovely having a separate voice and someone to actually challenge us, because we are open to debate, and it's nice to hear other viewpoints as well. However, what is clear is that this has just been the start of something exciting, and you joining us has led to more stimulating debate, and I really do hope you will join us again for future episodes.
Be my pleasure.
Wonderful. I think that our next episodes will involve further exciting discussions of this fascinating question, and that there will be a few surprises in store for us as we continue to raise the so-called Procreation Sonnets. And if you want to jump ahead, why not get a copy of Marlowe's Complaint by Dr. Peter Hodges, the book that kick-started all of this. Until then, keep safe and see you soon.